Now I'd like to welcome to the stage our panel of esteemed guests. As I say your name, you may come up and take a seat. Syed Kazem Sajadpour, Deputy Foreign Minister for Research and Education of Iran and President of the Institute for Political and International Studies. Welcome. We'll have you. Please take a seat right here. Thank you. Lord Nazir Ahmed, member of the House of Lords of the United Kingdom. Javed Jabbar, former Senator and Federal Minister of Pakistan. Joran Schockenbroek, Director of Anti-Discrimination, Directorate General of Democracy for the Council of Europe. Okay. And Francois Bourgat, member of the European Council of Foreign Relations. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started. Joran Schockenbroek, I'll start with you. What do you believe is behind this rise in nationalism that we're seeing now? And do you see any commonalities between the nationalism that we see now and that of the early 20th century?
Hello? Yes.
There we go.
To start with your first question, what is behind the rise of nationalism is certainly, as the overall theme of our forum suggests, is globalization is part of the picture. But I believe there is a wider situation that leads people to be disoriented. There have been several revolutions in recent decades. We've seen the digital revolution at work. We've seen the internet revolution, an overkill of information. People are also facing growing social inequalities in many countries. And speaking for Europe, this is certainly the case also in Europe. All these situations brought together lead people to often to be disoriented, to feel a certain nostalgia for a past that which was much more predictable. And people's fears and sense of insecurity can easily be exploited by politicians. Politicians playing a nationalistic card or a populistic card. So I think that is, I think, the situation right now. In terms of parallels with the 1930s, we see some of the phenomena which are rather worrying in terms of concepts of democracy that we have in Europe. We have evolved since the Second World War away from a formal procedural democracy, which means that the winner takes all and the majority decides, the dictatorship of the majority, if you like. We have injected many substantive elements in our conceptions of democracy, which are about human rights, about equal dignity, which are about the rule of law. And what we see currently is that these phenomena, these principles, which are key for what the Council of Europe stands for, are being eroded.
Mm-hmm. Lord Nazir Ahmed, you're a member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom and the first Muslim peer. Tell us what you've seen with the rise of identity politics in the United Kingdom, particularly when it comes to Brexit.
I was hoping that you'd not mention Brexit.
It was a busy weekend, wasn't it?
Just to remind ourselves, when I grew up, for me, political parties and leaders used to make promises that when they get elected, they would provide opportunities, jobs, prosperity. Sadly, for a number of years now, 9/11 and afterwards, politicians make promises of making you secure, providing security and foreign relations. And of course, there is the jobs and other, and getting rid of poverty is there. But I see there is a lot of online and globalization does have effect on British population too, because when you see Geert Wilders, for instance, Marie Le Pen, Freedom Party, Pegida in Germany, then people who are supporting UKIP and Brexit Party, they also tend to use the same language. For me, politicians don't condemn some of the language that is being used. Many, many years ago, during Tony Blair's government, I was asked to go and speak at the OSCE conference in Vienna, where I talked about Islamophobia and the rise of racism. Everybody was horrified in the room. Quite a few years later, I went there and I spoke about similar things. Nobody was surprised because they've seen it all over Europe. So a lot of this, in my view, is global now, but is coming, whether it is the RSS and the Hindutva fascists in India, whether it is KKK in America, they link through Europe, and that comes across to our island as well.
Mm-hmm. But why do you think that this type of language has become acceptable?
Some of it, I think, is because of the popular belief, because of what some of these groups use, and the politicians and even the media think that it's popular, and so they don't challenge it. And challenging has become a little more difficult for politicians, and they've tried to ignore it for so long. And of course there is on both, where you have those people in the right and the fascist movements, and then you have also, I've seen whether it was Osama bin Laden or ISIS or some Daesh, and then you have the other groups as well who are using their own terminologies, and nobody is prepared to challenge them, and so usually it's the populist thing that people want to play on, because it's votes, it's power, it's also attention from media as well as the public.
Mm-hmm. Javed Jabbar, I want to get over to you. How and why are governments and politicians exploiting social insecurities to increase these nationalist sentiments?
You know, while it is tempting to make politicians scapegoats, it is important to remember that they are elected. In all democracies, it is the people who, in their lack of wisdom or wisdom, elect people and then spend the rest of the time cursing them. The buck, I think, stops with the people. And with the flawed democratic systems that Asia and Africa and Latin America have accepted from Westminster or Washington, D.C., democracy is a perpetual work in progress. Neither North America, neither Europe, neither the United Kingdom, which are held up as the models of institutional democracy, have been able to deter or to check and prevent the regression and the deterioration into the basest instincts of humanity. So this arrogance that democracy has arrived needs to be revisited. And I think we need to see that the process of globalization, which on the one hand distributes power and empowers an individual village illiterate woman with a cell phone, equally diffuses power and therefore makes power unmanageable. And that is where governance structures in most countries are unable to handle this new phenomenon of power reasserting itself.
Okay. Syed Kazem Sajadpour, how have identity politics and heightened nationalism eroded multiculturalism around the world, and particularly in the West, because we are seeing this, it seems, particularly heightened in the West?
First of all, let me thank you for organizing such a wonderful gathering.
Is your microphone on, first of all? Okay, there we go.
So let me first thank TRT for inviting me and being in such a wonderful gathering. In response to your question, I think what we have is the politics of fear. there is actually, the situation can be read in a type of psychological frame. And the fear politics is benefiting politicians and is also satisfying those who have been thinking they have lost. And I think three issues are important here: fear, loss, and control. So it is a mechanism for control in a way, that they shelter in this type of identities, and they think, since they are so fearful, and nobody is talking about psychology of hope, psychology of change, they all reckon upon fear. And if you see this psychology, what has happened in the world is the psychological equation, and I think the base of this identity politics is fear. Second point is the role of technology should be also taken into account. Technology in this respect is creating identity. Sometimes I think of a type of technology-based identity. If you take the technology out, will we have such fear politics, fear identity? So it is not. And I think the result is a confusion, conflict. Everybody's angry. So you see an anger, and I think this anger relates to the fear, to loss of control. So what I think can be done, just management of fear, management of loss, and maybe a mechanism for control.
Mm-hmm. But this politics of fear, is this real or manufactured? We heard President Trump talk about this invasion from the south when they have to build the wall. Is this a real fear, or is this something that is being manufactured by politicians to keep them in power?
It is both. I mean, there is, of course, as it was in your very good introduction, there are people who think they have lost their supremacy. And it's real. Multiculturalism in the United States is a phenomenon of the last 3 decades. Minorities are getting voices. It's not just the white domination, as we were calling WASP, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant American, is not dominating as it was before. So there is an element of, let's say, reality, but the way also it is manufactured, the way that it is packaged and articulated, of course, it was also in Dr. Anwar Ibrahim's point, a vision, an articulation of vision is not really constructively made, so it is based on fabrication, false, and I think, I may add, it is by instant politics. The moment is important. It is not going beyond just the moment. So there is a ground, there is a background, there is a context, but manipulation, fabrication, and false and fake ideas and identities are also in the scene.
Francois Bourga, I haven't forgotten about you over there. How can the consequences of identity politics that we're seeing be rolled back, but while also addressing legitimate grievances that can often underlie these issues? Right. The consequences of identity politics that we're seeing, how can these be addressed and rolled back, but at the same time addressing the grievances that have led to these?
I have the idea that the dominant in this situation have to address issues which they have not addressed yet. Let's take the example I know the best might be the French. As long as we do not face the colonial history and we don't write this dark page, we cannot move beyond. Mm-hmm. Let me wrap this up with a little secret. Please do not listen. I happen to be one of those who have elected President Macron. I did it for 2 reasons. The first one is not the main one. There was no alternative except the extreme right. But the second reason was probably more important. I heard Mr. Macron right after the horrible massacre of November 2015, say a little sentence which was so important. He said, "We bear a share of responsibility." And then it developed, he said, glass ceilings which prevent people to move into the society. We must open up the society, blah, 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 blah. So this impressed me even more than what he had said about our colonial history when he said, some of what we have done in Algeria might be referred to as a crime against humanity. For this reason, I voted for this person. 2 weeks ago, the very same person lost completely his ability to analyze, to accept a share of responsibility in our history, in the dysfunctioning of our society, and he said there is one single enemy, political Islam, radical Islam, and this is it, okay? Days later, a Muslim mother was prevented to enter the facilities of a fire station, or another one, an elected council, and here came the assessment, the official assessment, not of Madame Le Pen, but of the Minister of Education. And he said, yes, legally, this lady should have been allowed inside, but in our society, the veil is not desirable. Islamic veil is not desirable. So this is no longer the problem of Rassemblement National. It's the entire society which, and now if you go to the root cause, does not accept that it is losing its hegemony in producing the discourse of universality. They don't want someone to come up on the scene of universality. They want to keep their good old monopoly. You know, identity politics, in my business, it was something linked to the non-Western world. We do not have such a problem. We have universality. We are the owners of universality. So if we go to the root cause, is that we have to deconstruct this dysfunctioning of our mind and accept the idea that diversity means also sharing political power.
Okay, Nazir, you had a comment.
I just wanted to expand on the Deputy Foreign Minister's answer. The fear which is exploited by politicians. So in terms of Brexit, many of those towns and constituencies where people voted overwhelmingly for Brexit were those who didn't come across any ethnic minorities or the migrants in those constituencies. So it's exploited by politicians, whether it is the Brexit Party or whether it's the Conservative Party. Similar to, I want to remind everyone that in June, when Aung San Suu Kyi, when she came to Hungary. Now, here's a lady who was praised around the world for human rights and great record, and she shared platform with the Prime Minister of Hungary and said that the world has to fear Muslims. But it's not only what she's done, because I know what she's done to Rohingya. I know what the Burmese have done, but not enough politicians or media have condemned her and the Hungarian Prime Minister for saying that. And so for ordinary working class, less educated people in the West or anywhere in the world, it's that fear then that becomes a kind of a real threat. And so therefore, in most of these countries, you will see that it is exploited by politicians, but not challenged enough by those who are in authority or who have the knowledge, who can do it.
Okay, and Javed, did you have something to add as well? No? Okay.
I can.
Okay, Joran, go ahead.
Thanks. I mean, among the strategies, I hope we'll also have an opportunity to discuss tactics and strategies on how to move away from this situation. I think that is very important. What I think is needed is an old-fashioned concept called human rights, universality of human rights, as a basis for a common discourse, for a common understanding. Now, this sounds very old-fashioned and has been, but globalization has brought us, after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has seen a fantastic human rights revolution around the world, which is incomplete, but which still is and has, in my view, the only basis to be the only potential basis for a common understanding, not only between countries, between nations, but especially also universality inside society. To understand that, as you suggested, Rachel, in the beginning, that we're not talking about a zero-sum game. More rights for my neighbor means less rights for me. No, human rights are not a zero-sum game. It's my rights are your rights. And if I protect my neighbor's rights, I'm protecting my own rights, I'm protecting society. I think what we need to do is to build a political discourse which is strongly founded on these common values.
Okay, and Javad?
Thank you. Just want to be a bit more optimistic. The fact is, with great respect to some of the preceding comments before this session, poverty does exist. But in the past 40 years, there has been a phenomenal, unprecedented reduction in global poverty. It's another matter that population growth sometimes, demeans that success. So let us not be despondent. I think humanity collectively has made an enormous successful effort to combat poverty, which is one of the root causes for explosive birth of identity politics. The second and last thing I want to say on this subject is that despite this segmentation and fragmentation into basic primeval identities, there is also the emergence of global solidarity. Now, this animosity, the hostility against the invasion of Iraq by the United States and European partners was a subject that evoked global solidarity. It may not have been enough to prevent that invasion, but for some time there was this marvelous sense of sharing. And the second is that there is also a great sense of global compassion. People willing to donate money across frontiers. Look at the data on global charity, consistently growing. The desire to help someone who you don't know. You're not connected by race or religion or language. And that's a great wellspring to draw upon and to build new global frameworks and institutions and strengthen values that actually do exist amongst people. So we should not give up on globalism. The globalization being promoted by the West is another form of colonialism because of aggressive capitalism. But there is much to draw upon from our collective sense of humanity.
Joran, I'd like to throw another question back at you. Liberalism often claims to hold exclusivity on dealing with and managing diversity. However, the argument could be made that secular liberal approaches to diversity, bounded as they are with capitalism and consumerism, have actually eroded true diversity around the world. In this context, is liberalism really the best avenue in which to deal with diversity?
That's a very deep question. It's funny, I mean, we hear in many places and we read the concept of liberal democracy, which is being then opposed to concepts like illiberal democracy. This is a discourse we hear in Europe in particular. Funnily enough, in the Council of Europe, which is an organization to defend democracy, human rights and the rule of law, we don't use such qualifications like liberal democracy. We speak about pluralism and we speak about genuine democracy, which is, genuine democracy is the concept that democracy is not only about winning elections, and who wins elections decides. It's also respect for minorities, to allow minorities to become possibly majorities in the future, not to crush opponents, but to respect people, and to ensure that basic rights are protected. So when it comes to that kind of democracy, I think that is the best way of respecting diversity, because it means respecting the rights, giving equal opportunities to people to participate in societies, not to ride roughshod in an authoritarian way over whole categories or classes of people in society, but to be inclusive. One of the strategies we very much advocate and try to put in practice also, especially at city level, in towns in more than 130 cities around the world is that of intercultural integration. That is connecting people. To move away from, if you like, multiculturalism, the old style, which is to a large extent actually indifference and ignorance, and people living in compartments in parallel societies, but it's about connecting people, ensure that they interact, that there is understanding, that the diversity is cherished and valued. So those are concepts, I think, that are absolutely crucial to make sure that diversity has its full place.
Mm-hmm. Francois, I saw you over there earlier on your phone and with your computer. By the way, if you're tweeting or on Instagram, please remember to use the hashtag TRT World Forum. But I wanted to ask you about social media's role in what we're seeing with the rise in nationalism. Do you think that can be partly to blamed, especially with Facebook, where people tend to follow pages or people who have similar experiences and beliefs as them?
Social media, they are like identity politics. They can be both. Let me tell you a little story about Facebook. I was living in Syria when the uprising started. Do you know that Facebook was prohibited at that time? What was the reaction of the regime, of the authorities? They authorized Facebook, okay? And now, please do not listen. What happened? The regime bought from two corporations which happened to be French, I'm sorry, the technology to control Facebook. So the government waited like 6 months. And in November, boom, he arrested almost 2,000 activists. So social medias are very, very important, but I would not put them in a black or white situation. They are in the hands of the protesters, but they are also in the hands of the regime, and we have seen how sophisticated now are the ways to manipulate them for the sake of dictators. So, you know, there's not a clear answer. We have said Al-Qaeda resulted from internet. And also, in the ancient time in France, you know, we have blamed automobile because there was a gang of people robbing banks and they were running away in automobiles. So it is not a right direction. Since the word exists, the dominants and the minorities have instrumentalized the possibilities to express themselves and to act and to defend their interests. This is my position. It's not black and white. We cannot blame the social medias.
Nazir, do you think it's too idealistic to assume that countries can pursue democracy, self-determination, equitable economic systems, and globalization simultaneously?
Yes,
Can you turn your microphone on?
Yes, I think it is very possible, but there has to be checks and balances in the direction that those countries go. Self-determination is very important, and it is resisted by colonial or bigger powers. But it is possible to benefit from globalization. What worries me is the fact that when you have these online associations of people, we've seen obviously with the right wing and fascist movements. What worries me is even organizations, for me, I thought the Buddhist religion was the most peaceful religion in the world. And what we've seen in Burma, what they've done to the Rohingya community, or in Sri Lanka, that also is very frightening. So, you know, it has to be very sort of carefully worked out. But globalization is good for economic reasons, for education, for technology, for many, many other things. But you need to know, I have no idea what dark web is, and I have no idea of some of the sites that actually attract some of these evil, bad people. But it seems like that they're still beyond control. I mean, the authorities, whether they are in Europe, in America, they've not been able to control them completely. So they still gather information from across the world, whether it was the terrible man who committed crimes in Norway against 70, 80 civilians, or the one who did it in New Zealand. They all have some connection to these fascist movements. So this globalization does pose some challenges. But I personally think that it's a good thing, but we need to tread very carefully.
For sure. Because in your opinion, what would an alternative to the current state of globalization and its perceived failures look like?
A very good question. I think it depends on all how you manage it. So the globalization, of course, we have a definitional problem. It depends how you define it, because everybody is defining globalization with a different angle. But I think as we generally understand it, we have to manage it. And for the management of it, you have to, first of all, have a good analytical capacity. Because we fail to understand the complexity, so we simply jump to very quick solutions or quick reading of the situation. I think if you want to manage the situation, first you have to have a good analysis of where are you, what are the costs and benefits, which area should you be globalized, which area should you be really very local, and so on and so forth. So this analysis, I think, is the base. And I think here you should also keep in mind, don't yield to, the second point is, to normative arrogance of the West. West is the West, we know the technology, we know the past, but there is an arrogance, normative arrogance, that they feel they are superior to the others in everything. And even inside the West, now you see the right wing think they have the normative superiority on others and ignoring the others. I think you have to have your own values. Of course, some values are universally accepted, but I'm proud that I'm Iranian. I have my own values. When I'm in Turkey, I really am proud of the Turkish culture and civilization. Last night I was in a ceremony called Arba'in by Shia minority here, which is the 40th day after Ashura. It was so interesting. First time I see such a wonderful group with so much, let's say, universality, in the meantime, difference. And difference, they have managed, the program was, it was so universal, I couldn't understand it. I don't know Turkish, because the language was very universal, the emotions were very universal, but everything was Turkish. So I think we have to be proud of our values, our systems, our culture, and just don't yield to what the others are talking about. And finally, what I say, which I noticed last night, and it is very important, is accepting the others as they are. I think this is one of the key in the management of everything, including globalization. Globalization, that shouldn't be that, you know, we should be like the others, or the others should be like us. If we are white supremacists, everybody should be like us or should be diminished. I think this is a wrong normative setting. So what, in a nutshell, I'm saying, we have to deal with a good analysis, understand the situation, the complexity. Now, I have an example here. There are so much criticism of Turkey, but there is not such good analysis of where Turkey is in this very difficult security situation.
Right.
A good analysis, I think, is the base of understanding and managing the situation. I don't want to say that I approve whatever is happening, but what I'm saying is try to understand, try to analyze the complexities, then you have understanding. Now I think this understanding is here. And don't yield to the arrogance of the other, and accept. I think these are maybe 3 aids of managing difficult times.
Right, the news coverage from the West certainly does seem to be very one-sided against Turkey. Javed?
Yeah? Thank you. That, I think, brings up the issue of the need to particularize identity politics in the context of each nation. Take 3 countries together, Turkey, Iran, historical nations. Their borders may have been settled in the 20th century, but these are historical identities based on religion, based on race and language and so on. Pakistan, the odd man out. Before the word was invented in 1932, there was no concept of what is Pakistan. So there's no Pakistani race or no Pakistani language. Of course, Urdu is our lingua franca, spoken by only 9% as their mother tongue. We are evolving into a nation. Therefore, dealing with multiple identities within the Pakistani nation state is a great challenge. Maintaining them, trying to make them cohesive, respecting pluralism without allowing pluralism to go towards outright secession, which we have experienced in 1971, thanks to a little help from a certain neighbor, which always loves giving help in such situations. So, the question of identity politics must be rooted in the specific context of each country. I was struck by a remark made before we began our session, which said, now President Trump wants to react to, more or less this was what was said, to the fact that it used to be a white majority country. America? America was a native American country.
Correct. Yep.
Whose land was taken over. They were dispossessed, they were massacred, either through cholera, typhoid brought by Europe, or by guns. So today, yes, they are in a majority. So each nation state has a different category of origin. Historical states, mass migrated states, post-colonial states whose borders were drawn arbitrarily by the departing colonial powers, religion-based states, and states that have religion in common and yet are very, very distinct. 420 million Arabs divided into 22 states in conflict with each other. So there is no one single broad stroke we can prescribe. How do you deal with identity politics? It has to be seen in the context of each country's and region's conditions and prescribe what is necessary.
It's very complex indeed. Francois, go ahead.
Since we need some good news, at least we should mention the fact that identity politics with this dark color, because there are 2 different colors, in the hand of minorities, it's not to restore some of their dignity, it is not dark. But we should mention the fact that we are living presently in Lebanon, a very dramatic move of a country moving out of identity politics. The specificity of what is going on now in Lebanon is that for the first time in contemporary history, social demands are being expressed out of the jail of the religious belongings. For the first time, people of workers of Hezbollah are demonstrating with Christians. And so this is a good signal that identity politics is not everywhere on the planet nibbling or damaging democracy. The pessimist conclusion would be that in the so-called Orient, non-Western world, my conviction is that people are moving slowly out of identity politics and installing some kind of democracy at a time when I am afraid on the other side of the West and the rest, identity politics used as a tool to prevent minorities to access to their legal rights is raising, and that's, I'm afraid, would be my pessimist conclusion.
Okay. Jorn, globalization and free trade have increased global prosperity. However, they've also increased inequality around the world, both within and between countries. There's a belief that white identity politics is driven less by poverty than by a sense of fragility, a sense that one's economic status is endangered. Do you think there's any evidence to that, or are we going back to this belief this politics of fear?
Yes, I think this is a correct assessment. I would link it in particular what we see in the development of populism, which in the continent that I know best, in Europe. Interestingly, populism has been most successful in some of the strongest economies. So there is no direct causal connection between poverty and the rise of populism. So it seems that it's not the objective threat to prosperity, but it's the perception of a threat that is more defining in this area. A sense of potential loss of future prosperity that make people vulnerable to populist discourse that scapegoats aliens, ethnic groups, the enemy, religions, nations. I think we as human beings, this is very human, we are afraid of losing of what we already possess. And the richest countries have the most to lose. Mm-hmm. So I think this calls for perhaps also a more emphasis in many countries on economic and social rights. We see that there is an increased attention for that, which has been in international human rights law a bit neglected, has received less attention than civil and political rights. So I think this is certainly a countermeasure that is necessary to avoid this trap. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Francois, to an extent, we do need identity politics. How else do we combat issues like the systemic killing of black men, homophobia, gender violence? But does identity politics serve a useful purpose, or does it really just create deeper divisions?
It depends in whose hand this tool is being used. If it is in the hands of the original indigenous nations of North America, we need identity politics. If it is in the hands of so many minorities, including, is my microphone? Yeah. Including the Muslims in the West, we need some kind of identity politics. Now, once again, because I said it before, when it is in the hands of those who are in a situation of hegemony and who instrumentalize this identity politics to extend, to worsen their hegemony, now we have to get rid of it. In the long run, if we had perfect institutions distributing the political resources, we would not need identity politics. Mm-hmm. But as long as we are not in this perfect institutional world system, I'm afraid, yes, we need some of it.
Mm-hmm. But does it not heighten our differences rather than focusing on what we have in common?
Yes. Well, you can say this, of course. You can always, I don't know if you say the glass can be half empty or half full. Mm-hmm. We have to extend what we have in common, but when I'm afraid to be Franco-French, but when I hear the discourse of my state, of the ruling elite, and when I hear what they consider we have in common, and when I understand that this excludes citizens which we have brought in our nation. If we have Muslims in France, it is because of the colonial past, and it is because of the years of rapid growth right after the war. If I hear what we have in common is something that prevents you to exist with a veil, then I have to say, no, sorry, I want some historicity, I want some identity politics to make sure that those who have the hegemony of expressing universality are not distorting this notion and allow the others to come in.
Mm-hmm. And Nazir, you had something to add?
Just on Francois' discussion on identity politics for, say, Muslims in the West. I don't know of any Muslims who may have used identity politics or who have been elected as Islamic party in any country. They may, for instance, I formed the National Forum of British Muslim Councillors very long time ago. When I was a councillor, raised lots of issues when I went to the House of Lords on Muslims' rights, because most of my colleagues would forget the issues related to halal meat and the prayer facilities, etc. Francois, last night we were discussing French attitudes, and I hope you don't mind. He said, so long as you can have a glass of wine, you are fine Muslim. And there are some societies in the West where if you are like them, if you want to have a bacon sandwich and a glass of beer, then you are one of them and you are accepted as a Muslim. But if you want to reject all that, then you're not. So it's not, this identity politics is not used for political purposes. It's for, like the trade unions did, like many other groups to have their rights. They've used identity for those purposes, but not against others, like minorities. So that's why I come back to, for instance, India, because we're talking about global issues. So the Hindutva movement, for instance, does not want to tolerate any minorities, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Muslims, even Dalits. They are threatening, time again, their mainstream politicians are talking about converting everyone back to Hinduism by 2025, 2030, by force if needs be, and that's why this lynching videos and everything, the fear driven into people that this is how you will be treated if you remain as you are. So I think identity politics to call for your rights, whether it is LGBT community, whether it is women, whether it is trade unions, whether it is ethnic minorities, blacks, of course, for your rights, that's good. But if you're doing it to oppress the others and to create fear of the other, like most of the fascist movements have done in Europe, they've used refugee crisis for their own benefits and sort of like linked it with Islam and Muslims. That's where it gets a little dangerous.
Do you think then that some identities are too narrow and it's not possible to come to, for example, the Israelis and Palestinians?
Yes, I mean, again, you see the politics in Israel, for instance, very much on those lines. If you went into, and the hate for the Palestinians, and that sort of like translates into the hate for the Muslims, whether it is in search for more land or to try and take over their rights and not to give them rights. It brings those little groups together. And that's why you see so many little political parties, and of course Netanyahu benefits from all that.
Javed, you wanted to add something?
With regard to this implication it has for democracy, isn't it disturbing that three of the world's most robust democracies, India, Israel, and you have to concede that Israel is a democracy despite its barbarity, the United States of America, very vigorously democratic, yet today they threaten their own citizens and they are a threat to their neighbors. So there is something at the heart of the current systems of democracy, the electoral system, for example. We have electoral democracies, but we do not have representative democracies. Because, for example, voting is not compulsory in most countries, except in 22 countries. And even that does not make it democratic, because you have then got majoritarian democracy. And look at the absurdity of the Brexit verdict. On a fundamental constitutional structural change, they do not specify it. And with a 52% margin of victory, you create a catastrophic crisis for Britain itself and for Europe and the rest of the world. So there is a fundamental need to reassess democratic systems and to tinker with them, refine them constantly to accommodate identity politics in a benevolent, positive, constructive way so that it doesn't become ugly identity politics.
And you had something to add?
Yes, I think what's important, identity is one of the most important issues in all social science and humanities field, but it is in response to one question, that if you are asked, who are you? You say, I'm this. What's happening right now, this negative or negating self-description is overruling the positive side. What do I mean? If you ask me, I say, who are you? I'm Iranian, I'm Muslim, I'm this and that. But what's happening right now is the negative identity. You are defining yourself not who you are really, who you are against. And I think this negation, this rejection, this exclusivity, this hatred, this fear, this animosity is the source of problem. And I think this is where we have to really overhaul the whole issue and redefine it, that we don't need to just negate the others. At the end, all of us are human beings. So there is a human identity for all of us, and these should be really reinforced. I have a second point, that look, all these talks, of course, they relate to the rest, but it is about the West, mostly. There are some elements in other parts, but we keep in mind that the world is not just the West. And I think even on the identity politics, as we discussed, maybe there is an inclination that we have to see the world in just a Western paradigm. I think the West is important, is an important part of what we have globally, but the rest matters so much. And the rest are a huge number of communities here and there, and they should also be kept in mind. And here, I think if you go to different identities in the rest, you see we are not defining particularly ourselves in the negations of the others, and there are many lessons to learn. In Turkey and in Iran, and in this area, we celebrate a personality called Rumi. Rumi, he was the place he was born, the place he was buried, the language he had his poems are very interesting. I don't want to go to detail because there is no time, but there is a sense of humanity. There is a humanity-based identity, a positive identity when you read his poems. I think this is, let's say, one of the outcomes of the rest. Rumi was before the West became West. And I think this is one lesson that we have to keep in mind, that the rest is important, and everything not is in the West. And what we have to define is a positive formation and articulation of our identities and see issues as they are.
Right, so in the face of this rising negative identity politics, what do you think the future holds for globalization?
I think the globalization would have diversity, would have, of course, still there is, because of media, you have a connection on what the West produces, the other may be impacted immediately. But I see not just the Western domination in globalization. You see different sources of power and places of power are emerging. Look at Asia, Eurasia. I think right now, who can say just the world is the West and can ignore China, can ignore Russia, can ignore Turkey, can ignore Iran? I think these are regional and global powers in the same format. I think globalization have different patterns. It is not one universal prescription for everybody. Mm-hmm. Look at the Chinese Belt and Road. Isn't it a globalization by road? Mm-hmm. It is, but it is not globalization in the, let's say, normative arrogance of values and so on and so forth. So we have a diversity of definitions, places, processes, and this is why I say the future is not just the West, and the rest should be considered, and globalization doesn't have just one global, let's say, format. there are different ways that globalization is going to be used, manipulated, articulated, and managed.
Okay. Okay, so we're getting down to the final minutes of this discussion. I want to make sure each of you are able to get in some last words. So I want to ask one question, if each of you can give me an answer. Do you think that we will start to see a backlash against globalization? And what happens once these politicians who've been elected based on identity politics, such as Donald Trump, what happens when they leave office? Francois, let's start with you down at the end.
Time to make up my answer. Whenever I give lectures for the last 20 years, my concluding remark was, I do hope that all of what I told you tonight is wrong and that the near future will be better. I must say that the lady who introduced this wonderful meeting said that she was deceived to have to face the same issue that a couple of years ago. Believe me, for the last 40 years, I've been answering the same question. Is democracy compatible with Islam? And it's not moving in the good direction. So until now, I leave it upon the rest of the panel to give optimistic concluding remarks. Mm-hmm. Mine cannot be.
Okay, Joran, go ahead.
I'll do my best. I think in response to your question, what we can say is that the ultimate recipe, I think, against things getting out of hand is to make societies more resilient, democracies more resilient, and that means make people more resilient. There's an enormous amount of work to be done, and we in Europe play our part in a modest way in the Council of Europe, is to build up education for democratic citizenship, human rights educations, media literacy, internet literacy for children and for older people, to make sure that voters actually are integrating common human values, human rights, into their decision-making, into their voting, and that they will not be fooled by political leaders that actually have very simple populistic, nationalistic messages that are very dangerous, in fact. So there is an enormous amount of work to be done in that area. You mentioned earlier the way our democracies function. There's something wrong with dysfunctioning in the representative models of democracy. I think that is correct. We see emerging now new thoughts about new forms of participatory, deliberative democracy, which are very important. I think that this is another line which certainly needs to be pursued, and we are playing our part there. I think those are some of the issues that democracies or democratic societies need to equip themselves to be stronger and to be more resilient against these negative phenomena.
Okay.
Thank you. I think this, the relationship between globalization and what happens to politicians of the future has to be seen in the connection or the lack of it between the nation state as a unit of organization that we have come to accept and national identity. In recent times, there has been an unfortunate negative reaction in some parts of global discourse against national identity. Now, when national identity, of course, becomes aggressive, as in Nazi Germany, it is a threat to the rest of humanity. But there are many constructive and essential elements to building national identity, whether it is in Turkey or whether it is in Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan is a new state. It has inherited 5,000 years of the Indus Valley civilization. How do we meld that with the 21st century and with segments of our society which are dispossessed? Because the nation state is inherently a centralizing concept. It concentrates power at the capital, in the armed forces, or in the macroeconomy. And the challenge is, how do we cater to the reality, the dignity of local identities without weakening the stability of the state? Mm-hmm. So there is much work to be done through a set of reforms, both social, political, and societal.
Okay, Nazir?
National identity is not a bad thing, but nationalism, which is used against minorities and others, is a bad thing. So therefore, tolerance, diversity, embracing other is very important. And I hope some of these right-wing nationalist fascists that have gained popularity in Europe and in the West will be decreasing. I mean, if you look at Austria, for example, they nearly came into power, and thank God they're just out. And in other countries too, in you know, most of the European countries, they haven't taken over, thank God. So I think they would be on decline, but we need to educate, but people need to be robust. They need to challenge them, they need to criticize them, and where necessary, even condemn them. And that means politicians as well as media.
Okay, and Kazem, we have only about a minute left. So
I think, first of all, these politicians will fail. Of course, they would have their own damage. Tensions would be created by them, but at the end, they cannot deliver. But very quickly, I think, 3 remedies. First, management of fear. We have to develop mechanisms for fear management, globally, regionally, even nationally, even on local levels. Second, I think management of diversity. We have to learn how to manage diversity. And finally, it is all about what this conference is about. That is the management of change. We have to learn how change should be managed, in which loss is minimized and gains are maximized.
Okay, and we are out of time. Before we thank our panel, I would like to remind you all, we have a coffee break coming up next. Please take all your belongings with you, as there will be security checks when we come back. And I would like to thank our panel, our esteemed panel here, Francois Bourga, Joran Schockenbroek, Javed Jabbar, Lord Nazir Ahmed, and Syed Kazem Sajadpour.